He is a 71-year-old American literary colossus whose ongoing Albany cycle of novels represents one of the true high-water marks in post-World War II fiction. Some people say that with his auburn hair, inquisitive eyes, and paradoxical, good-natured sense of wonder and doom, William Kennedy resembles an Irish-American poet in search of a mythical past, a gifted wordsmith short on blarney, but always ready with an apropos phrase or a trenchant observation. And although critics constantly try to label Kennedy and put him into some school of thought or philosophy, he really belongs to no school of writing. He's absorbed so much of so many writers that you can't possibly point out one that had influence more than others. I'm going to mention a few writers here and some of the things critics say, and then say that I think a better way to look at William Kennedy is through journalism. Although, for example, when early reviewers of The Ink Truck, which vividly tells the story of a newspaper strike in a thinly disguised Albany, when that came out, he was dubbed a manic 1960s surrealist, blessed with a wicked sense of humor. When Ironweed came out, which won the National Book and Critics Circle Award and the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, he became identified as a magical realist by some critics, and with comparisons often coming to Garcia Gabriel Marquez. In fact, I was amazed to see how many times Kennedy's Albany and certain critical scholarly essays are compared to Marquez's mythical South American town of Macondo. Literature teachers discussing his book Legs, which is a novel about the flamboyant Albany gangster Jack Legs Diamond, often claim he harkens back to some sort of detective fiction, like James Cain or something, only kind of with a upstate New York Celtic twist to it. The whole entire Albany cycle, I've read some say that it's Kennedy's version of Thornton Wilder's Our Town, where ghosts take center stage to retell the trials and triumphs of their all too brief lives. One scholar, I think fairly enough, found echoes of Sherwood Anderson, whose protagonist George Willard wanders through the interrelated stories in Winesburg, Ohio, just like the Phelan family in Kennedy's work. And of course, the most common critique is that Kennedy is some way emulated William Faulkner, turning his hometown of Albany on the Hudson into a northern Oxford, Mississippi, and comparisons of the Compson family that you'd find in Sound and the Fury. There's also, of course, people who talk about the influence of James Joyce's work, what Joyce did to Dublin, Kennedy's doing to Albany, for Albany. There are also those who kind of put William Kennedy in the Irish-American tradition, and lump them along with Eugene O'Neill and James T. Farrell, Flannery O'Connor, John O'Hara, F. Scott Fitzgerald, all writers who certainly were Irish, but they don't really share a exact similarity to group them in this Irish-American grouping, which is sometimes done, but it is fun to do and fun to think about the contributions of Irish-Americans to our country's literature. Well, all these literary characteristics touch on crucial elements of William Kennedy's fiction. One wouldn't dispute any of those claims by people. But I really think, after reading and thinking about it, that there are two main currents that can be felt in all of his work. One is Albany as a place, and second, really, is journalism as a springboard. And Kennedy once said about journalism, quote, "It's a great training ground. I was served enormously well by it. No bailsbondman, no lawyer, no politician, no bartender, no actor can enter into the variety of worlds that journalism can." And it was Kennedy's early apprenticeship in journalism that exposed him to a vast range of experiences that would ultimately form the core of Ironweed and Legs, Billy Phelan's Greatest Game, and Quinn's book. It forced him to become a keen observer and a tireless interviewer, and it nurtured him in a reverence for the historian's fact. And it taught him lessons about style that would mold his entire Albany cycle. It also, I think, taught him the importance of a strong lead. And one of the things I was talking about last evening at dinner was just what an incredible opening you have to Ironweed. That is like the dream. One of the first things you learn in journalism is how to get the lead. And it's probably one of the great leads ever. I won't read it all again for time factor, but just the notion of riding up the winding road of St. Agnes Cemetery in the back of a rattling old truck, Francis Phelan became aware that the dead, even more than the living, settled down in neighborhoods. You read that line, and really the whole first page, and you're just drawn right into the book. Journalism teaches you that. History, which I'm in, unfortunately doesn't. But I would also say that Journalism taught William Kennedy to be kind of dubious of secondhand accounts and to insist on doing his own reportorial digging. As Emerson once put it, it's the fronting of the fact, not dealing with life secondhand. And of course, daily assignments at the Albany Times-Union and San Juan Star allowed him to engage into a real world of real street people and discover the soullessness of lonesome inhabitants, which populate a lot of his fiction. Feature stories allowed him to conjecture about the meaning of observations and to experiment with style. All I wanted to do and be was Damien Runyon, Kennedy has noted about his early love of newspapers and about his burning boyhood desire to turn a catchy phrase. And in a 1985 interview with Peter Quinn, which is really superb, and Peter's here and I recommend it to you, it's in Riding the Yellow Trolley, Kennedy notes that he writes fiction, quote, for people like me who used to appreciate Damien Runyon's sentences, unquote. And perhaps when you think about it, the most frequent questions, I've now read all these interviews that people have done with William Kennedy, is he's always asked about the question of journalism versus novel writing, fiction versus nonfiction, probably more than almost any other writer. Maybe somebody like Tom Wolfe gets those questions so constantly, but William Kennedy does. And I would say even now, even though he's now really a full-time novelist, his day is not complete unless he reads the morning newspaper. And he's still known to carry a small memo pad with him to jot down details of everyday life in Albany. Now, Kennedy, of course, is not the first novelist who honed his literary skills as a newspaperman. Walt Whitman spent 25 years as a journalist editor before the first edition of Leaves of Grass was published. During the 1940s in Brooklyn, Whitman was considered, in fact, the master of the penny press. And I love a line in Song of Myself when Whitman, kind of reflecting on his journalism career, summed it up in this line, quote, you shall no longer take things at second or third hand. You shall listen to all sides and filter them through yourself. Of course, Missourian Mark Twain was a journalist for 20 years before he even wrote his first novel. Much of the material Twain used in his fiction was gathered while reporting on the Comstock Lode in California in the 1860s. Ernest Hemingway spent his apprenticeship years working at the Kansas City Star and writing nonfiction stories in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. But of course, with Hemingway, you get that famous break. He eventually ended up writing that he found newspaper work boring and unsatisfying. And this in a letter to Gertrude Stein, after he spent some time with her, Hemingway wrote, quote, I'm going to chuck journalism. This is 1923, Hemingway. I'm going to chuck journalism. You ruined me as a journalist last winter. Have been no good ever since. And Hemingway serves as sort of a point of discussion on, because he kind of abandoned journalism and had some harsh things to say about it in a typical Hemingway style. He becomes kind of a lightning rod in this debate of the value of a journalistic career as a springboard to becoming a fiction writer. Well, I think Hemingway was full of some bluster and kind of trying to get journalism out of his system to write fiction, because certainly, and if you just look at the list of pre-William Kennedy American journalists who became novelists or poets, it's absolutely staggering. I'm just going to read you a few names. Theodore Dreiser, John Dos Passos, William Dean Howe, Stephen Crane, Ambrose Bierce, Jack London, Frank Norris, Upton Sinclair, Willa Cather, James T. Farrell, Catherine Ann Porter, John Steinbeck, Richard Wright, Eugene O'Neill, Robert Frost, Eudora Welty, James Agee, Sinclair Lewis, James Weldon Johnson, Carl Sandburg. I don't need to go on. You get the point. In fact, Alexis de Tocqueville, traveling to America in the 1830s, us historians, we always have to stick to Tocqueville in there. In the 1930s, he commented on the influential role of journalists in the new country. And Tocqueville said, quote, the inhabitants of the United States have then at present, properly speaking, no literature. The only authors who I acknowledge as American are the journalists. They indeed are not great writers, but they speak the language of their countrymen, and they make themselves heard, unquote. And Professor Shelley Fishkin points out in her fine study, which I recently read, called From Fact to Fiction, that this pattern of going from journalism into fiction is not necessarily unique to America, but I think it's more unique here. And she goes on to talk about how Dickens's career in journalism, and Zola and Orwell and Marquez and Vargas Llosa and many other people that were men of journalism before they became men of letters. Well, journalism, of course, is not the only important influence on these writers' developments. I would be misstating it if I made it seem like journalism was it. When one considers William Kennedy, for example, one naturally has to reflect on his mother and father, on his time as an altar boy at Sacred Heart Church, his teachers at Christian Brothers Academy, his time spent in the U.S. Army, the James Cagney movies he watched growing up, the ghost encountered in Shakespeare's Hamlet or Dickens' A Christmas Carol, the girls he dated, the saloons he drank in. One could go on and on for hours about influences on people. But it is the workshop of daily journalism that early on gave him both the self-discipline and the fundamental skills to write quality fiction. And I've always believed in Sinclair Lewis's maxim that the first rule of writing is to put the seat of your pants to the seat of the chair. And I think journalism provides that sense of discipline. In other words, the newsroom at the Albany Times-Union, if you like, was William Kennedy's Iowa writer's workshop, and the San Juan Star was his bread loaf. Put more starkly, journalism is how Kennedy made a living while trying to learn the skills necessary to write first-rate fiction. And that can never be forgotten. And Don last night told me a funny Henry Miller Lawrence Durrell story, which again, I don't have the time to tell, but just on that fact that you do have to earn a living. And while you're reading when William Kennedy is working in the San Juan newspaper till 11 at night, eating dinner, coming home, and then working on his novel that's on the top of his desk till 2 a.m., he needs that journalism to give him his money, to actually survive, to have a family, and to live. And of course, that's the case with so many of these journalists who become fiction writers. So what I wanted to take a look at here is the Kennedy's apprenticeship in serious journalism from 1949 to 1975, and contemplate how that helps to explain the roots of his fictional subjects, styles, and themes. I think the question, at least for my part of the program today, is to answer what was the impetus that got William Kennedy interested in journalism? Was he any good at his trade? Can one find traces in his newspaper career in his great novels? Now, it'd be foolish to intimate that journalism taught Kennedy how to experiment with linguistic constructs and to inspire William Kennedy's surrealistic sweeps, because I don't think it did. I think reading fiction brought that into his work. Journalism did provide the foundation on which he developed the courage to find his own voice. Newspaper reporting is, Kennedy once noted, the job that has got to be the least boring profession in history. And journalism also taught Kennedy to put experience in action, if you like, ahead of philosophy in his fiction. And it taught him that life was rife with delusion and hypocrisy and fraud and forgetfulness. And according to Kennedy, journalism also taught him the value of vulnerability. And I had never heard that before, thought of that before. I've thought of some of these other things of journalism. So I just wanted to read you something on William Kennedy from his book, Riding the Yellow Trolley, an excellent collection of essays and book reviews and interviews and the like. And this is a very interesting point, I think, how journalism teaches one the need to be vulnerable, a vulnerability. I think it's a unique comment on his part here. Well, I'll just read. And this is an interview with Peter Quinn, who's sitting up in the front row here. And I'm going to skip a little part of it. Kennedy's talking about why he needed to leave. Exile came because I couldn't stay in Albany any longer and still function effectively. I had to go elsewhere. I went to Puerto Rico, which is exile under the American flag. It's as far away as you can get and still be in the USA. But cunning was not in my kit bag. I never felt that was necessary. I was always above board. I always put out my work for stomping, whatever I did, and I usually got stomped. But I never felt that it was necessary to retreat and stay home and nurse my wounds and never try again until I had a masterpiece. That was never my understanding of how to write or how to live as a writer. Somewhere along the line, I came across the phrase about, quote, renewing your vulnerability, unquote. And it seemed to me the most important thing for a writer. You renew your vulnerability constantly. You start out feeling so vulnerable that you're afraid the criticism will kill you. But if you're not afraid of being vulnerable, if you say, go ahead, hit me again, I can take it, you get a thick skin. You get that as a journalist. Letters to the editor demanding, throw this guy in the river, or why did you hire him to begin with? This man should be destroyed, or this is a radical, or this is a liberal, or some other dirty word. You get to live with that. I remember I wrote a series of articles on the slums of Albany back in the 60s. The mail attacking me came in like you couldn't believe. I got hate calls and hate mail from grand bigots, wonderful bigots, really creative bigots. It didn't faze me because I realized early on that when you get into this business of putting yourself out on the public chopping block, you have to figure out you're going to get chopped at it. That's a great lesson, I think, for the importance of journalism to becoming a writer. Getting your byline out there, reading it, taking hard hits, but being forced the next day. You might even make an error in a column that gets fought out that you made a factual error, but you got to go back the next day and write another story. And I think that had an immense influence on, if you'd like, the invincibility of William Kennedy, the sense of always persevering. You know, this is not somebody who ever threw in the towel. He kept at it and at it and at it and at it. And it wasn't until 1983 when Ironweed became the big hit that he got the recognition that was long deserved to him. But he struggled for a long time without a lot of money because he believed in it and he wasn't going to throw in the towel, that kind of toughness. Well, I thought I would take a quick look and a sort of quick biographical sketch of William Kennedy as journalist. And no big surprise, the story begins in Albany, where he was born on January 16, 1928. And he first began writing at the Century at Christian Brothers Academy. And I asked Bill Kennedy about the clippings there, if there are any. And he may or may not have some in his files, but I would think if somebody was doing work here, it'd be fun to go to the Academy or look for old issues and see if you can find anything. It's probably a hard job, but it is interesting. I'm writing a book on Jack Kerouac, and I found out he used to go to a Catholic church where they had a big book log out there, and Kerouac used to sign his name or write confessionals in this church book. And I went back to the church and asked the priest, and suddenly he dug them out, and there was 14-year-old Jean-Louis Kerouac, French Canadian, writing all these paragraphs in this church kind of book that nobody had looked at before. So I think that kind of investigation in William Kennedy's career needs to go forward. And certainly his archive someday is going to be a vast treasure trove for anybody wanting to study, the second half of the 20th century and beyond, due to the interviews he's done with all sorts of writers around the world, due to the correspondence he's had with major writers, due to the drafts he saved of all of his great novels. Well, of course, he went on to work as the editor of the Siena News, an associate editor of Beaverwick Magazine, both by Siena College here in New York. And he graduated in 1949 with a bachelor's degree in English and immediately became a sports writer and columnist for the Post-Star in Glen Falls, New York. And I have to pause at that to say he immediately became a sports writer and columnist. It shows a great deal of direction in the sense of what he wanted to do, to write, to leave college and go to a paper, and then the gumption, really, to not only, when you had to get drafted to go into the armed forces, which he soon did, he was drafted in 1950 and was in Europe for 2 years in Germany, to not break off that relationship with the paper, but as a man in uniform to start sending columns back home to the hometown paper of what was going on there. I think it shows, again, that burning, that extra initiative and desire to get into being a writer. And even at this early stage, I would say it's very clear that he wants to take his journalism not just extraordinarily seriously, but his hankering to write fiction, writing short stories. Someday we might get to see the unpublished short stories of William Kennedy in this period. There's a great debate going on of whether people should be exposed to this sort of thing. With Ernest Hemingway, who's centennial, maybe you read the story in the New York Times. They're bringing out a new Hemingway novel, and some people feel this shouldn't be happening. It was never meant for publication, and it actually will hurt, not enhance, Kennedy's reputation. There's always a debate whether Juvenilia really should be republished or published or not, but I will promise you in William Kennedy's case it will be someday, because it tends to be with major writers that comes out somehow. William Kennedy was discharged from the Army in 1952, And he learned many lessons during the time he served as the sports editor of the 4th Infantry Division's weekly newspaper, Ivy Leaves. And Ivy Leaves kind of looked like the Stars and Stripes, and he was stationed in Frankfurt. I think what he really learned, and again, journalism provided this for him, he learned he got to travel. He got to go see part of the world due to being, not just for being stationed abroad, but they provided him the opportunity to tour Scandinavia, to report on and cover the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, to go and talk to people in different countries all over. What an education for a young person. As you all know, you have students in college, you like to send them for a semester abroad, but to be able to go and ride around Europe in a Jeep and talk to people all over is just about the grandest education one could get for becoming a writer. And of course, always with a novel at your side while you're doing journalism. It's really, I think, the perfect recipe for becoming a writer. He also, I might mention, did some work with the Army Times during that period, which gets left out of some of the material I read. And I think, in his writing as a journalist this time, sports writing, his great interest in it, you're seeing the influence of Grantland Rice or Damien Runyon or Red Smith on him. Those are really, if you put up a mark of what you're striving for, I would say that was the mark he was striving for, to be as good as those guys. But I think pretty soon that mark went up and up and up. Not that there aren't extraordinary writers in some ways, that's still enough of an ambition, but I think when you start, while you're in Europe or in Puerto Rico and you're reading The Sound and the Fury, which William Kennedy told me was like a Chinese puzzle to figure out, you're realizing something else is happening there that because of the complexity of what's going on, and you start striving to learn more when you start reading that kind of literature. Well, in 1952, at 25 years old, he was discharged and hired here in Albany as a reporter for the Times-Union. And he worked at the newspaper from 1952 to 56 when he accepted a job as a reporter columnist for a new paper, the Puerto Rico World Journal in San Juan, where he became an assistant managing editor. That was an English language paper, daily, folded 6 months later. 52 to 56 in Albany. Really is not a bad post. I mean, imagine coming back and getting to actually work for a major paper like the Albany Times-Union in your hometown and get to see your byline. Doesn't matter whether you're writing about obituaries or about a sewage pipe breaking. The fact that you're in print in the hometown paper is quite a high, as any writer would know. But as he comments frequently in both interviews and in essays, he got bored with Albany and started disliking in many ways aspects of his town, as young people tend to do. He had just spent time in Europe, and now after a number of years here, still unmarried, working in his hometown of Albany, dealing with his family and friends, he wanted adventure and to get out there. And Puerto Rico provided that. As I said before, it was as far as you can go in exile, was still being in the United States in a way. And there he met Dana Sosa, who was the Broadway dancer, born in Puerto Rico but lived in New York, so was sort of, I guess, New Yorican might be the phrase. And if you can see how quickly William Kennedy's moving in his professional life, think how quickly he's now moving in his personal life. He met Dana on December 27th, and they were married on January 31st. So within just a month amount of time. And there's a story I read that when he first met Dana, he was sort of in a Hemingway phase of his life. And the first comment that he said to her was, in a Hemingway-esque fashion, "Good hair." Well, at that juncture, Bill Kennedy took a job reporting with the Miami Herald in Florida, and did some reporting on Cuban revolutionaries. He'd also got to really have the Caribbean and South America as his beat in many ways. I think he still maintains an intense interest in the region today. But imagine writing for the Miami Herald about Cuban revolutionaries at the time of Castro coming to power. That's heady journalism. That's not second-tier journalism. The Miami Herald is probably even today does some of the best work in articles and news articles on the hemisphere. And here he's writing about Castro and the changes. Nixon's famous visit to Latin America, where he's stoned and spat on, and the kind of turning of the end of the Eisenhower years to the beginning of Kennedy's Alliance for Progress. And when we're going to look at a kind of interesting moment to be thinking and contemplating Latin American history this century. That period of 58 to 63 with the Cuban Missile Crisis is probably one of the most intense, and William Kennedy was getting that experience at that time of writing big stories for a big newspaper. Well, after that time with the Miami Herald in 1959, Bill Kennedy returned to Puerto Rico and became a managing editor of the San Juan Star. And at that point, Dana performed on television, and she was a model. And she was also on the cover, I believe, of Look magazine. Somebody might want to look that up someday, but she was on the cover of Look magazine in that period. And then in, I think, 1960 interests me when you think about William Kennedy's career, because it's really the first time, if you're writing a biography, you can see these two burning ambitions, being a first-rate journalist, being serious at your craft of journalism, and then trying to be a novelist. And as often is the case, I think the influence of Saul Bellow, I mean, who would think, if somebody said to me, name where you would meet Saul Bellow in your life, I would not pick Puerto Rico. But Saul Bellow was in Puerto Rico teaching, and William Kennedy was taking creative writing classes like a lot of the students here at this conference are, and trying to just brush up on creative writing and literature, and then had that intersection with Saul Bellow, which we created a lasting friendship and a support mechanism. I mean, if Saul Bellow tells you, you know, kid, you're doing well, you're writing well, boy, I mean, that's enough fuel to keep you going for a decade. And so I think that was a very important intersection in his life. And constantly, of course, having that proverbial novel in the desk drawer. It's not by accident that William Kennedy dedicates this book, riding the yellow trolley, to, I'm sure most of you already know, the book is dedicated to all journalists with a novel in the desk drawer. And that was clearly him in that moment when he was dealing with Bellow and trying to write his novel and write serious journalism. What is interesting, we don't have time for it, is that San Juan in 1960, Hunter Thompson recently brought out his first novel called the Rum Diary, and he tries to capture some of that. But of course, as typical with Hunter's writing, it's really about Hunter, not so much about Puerto Rico, which is Hunter's strength and weakness. But there's some great parts in that book to read. And they were working at the San Juan Star at this point. And imagine 1960, a new paper, and the editor wins William Dorvillier, William Dorvillier won a Pulitzer Prize. Here they've just started a new paper, and they get to be part of a team that the editor just won a Pulitzer Prize for the editorials on the church-state controversy. And so that created that. There's a whole great story about this group down there, I think, in that period, and it's rich for a biographer of William Kennedy someday. And then in 1961, William Kennedy resigned his full-time position as San Juan Star and really started working in earnest on writing his novel, The Sparrows and the Angels. The Angels and the Sparrows, which parts of it later made it in different ways into others of his books, including Ironweed. Well, in 1963, I'm moving a little quicker through the chronology here, just so I can make some final observations and we can open this up for a talk. But in 1963, William Kennedy returned to Albany to take care of his father, who was ill, and he began again reporting for the Times-Union. But boy, is it a difference that Puerto Rico, Bellow, Dana interlude made in his life. Because when he came back in 1963 and began writing a series on Albany newspapers, I think you could see it's a different William Kennedy. These stories eventually became the raw material for Oh, Albany, which wasn't published till 1983. But, his reporting on Albany in this period is immersing himself into the neighborhoods, into issues of race and religion, politics, corruption, gangsters, just looking at things, but particularly with those early essays were about they were entitled as a series, The Changing Face of Albany. And it was really Albany's urban scape was undergoing a dramatic change as really hundreds of houses were being destroyed or demolished. These kind of new, we now know better, hopefully in this country, not to rip down our great old buildings. And how sadly we miss them. I live in New Orleans, and I-10, the great interstate, and it's very important, I-10, because it connects Jacksonville to Santa Monica, and it gives us our food. Our truckers drive on it, and I thank God for Interstate 10 for convenience sake, but it destroyed Storyville, the great jazz neighborhood. It went smack through it because it was the black neighborhood. So if you want to go and find Storyville, you can't find it. And that happens, every city has that happened to it. Well, this angered William Kennedy, the kind of the preservationist, the historian in him, and it came across in these articles. And also it started seeing William Kennedy going back home and liking it, in a sense because he went back to the neighborhoods and talked to the old timers. And if I ever have an image of, if I had one photograph of William Kennedy, it would be him in a saloon talking to an old timer about what life used to be like in Albany, and or in their home, or in their church. And I think, that interest he had in what it used to be like before me, of ancestors, an understanding of ancestors and how, and the sort of the cycles of change. And of course, reading Faulkner would be an influence if you're thinking about that, if that's the literature you're reading while you're interviewing people in Albany. And one of the things I'll say briefly because of the time constraints, but in Albany, it's a marvelous book. It's an extraordinary work. Everybody in Albany should have a copy of it, and any parent who has a child and doesn't give them a copy of it, they're being remiss in their duties as parent, because it's a fundamental discussion of what this town's about and what it means. And there's a lot of humor in it. There's a lot of history in it. There's a lot of good journalism in it. But it doesn't fit any real category. There are now becoming very popular this notion of writing biographies of city in my field as historians. Instead of doing a biography of Thomas Jefferson, you pick a story and you tell the story, a biography of Kansas City, a biography of San Antonio. I think William Kennedy's is the most sophisticated version of that kind of study that we have in this country. And so beyond being an incredible novelist, take a look at his skills as a nonfiction writer in Albany. And as Kennedy writes, and one of the other things I like about William Kennedy, and particularly Albany, is the credit he always gives people. I'm a jazz fan. A lot of jazz musician friends always say, always thank the ancestors, the people you learned from, the people who gave you the quote. That book's filled with them. Even at the end, he's saying, oh my goodness, I'm done in this long book, and I didn't thank so-and-so, and I didn't tell you the story about this guy, and I didn't tell you about that. And also, another aspect that Kennedy writes, which all of us who write history or do any kind of research, I think, comes up with. Kennedy wrote, quote, I have pillaged hundreds of books to create this work. And I like that statement. My mentor and colleague, Stephen Ambrose, always says that the job of the historian is to read other people's mail. And you do feel many times like you're a snoop in people's lives in some ways when you're doing that kind of work. Well, William Kennedy ended up revising the articles in Old Albany, and from that, one of the interesting points I make is if you look at the articles as they are written, say in 1963, and then look at the revision that was done on them in the 80s, you can see how the novelist, now during that period from 63 to let's say 83, that 20-year period, William Kennedy had the Ink Truck published. He had Legs published. He had Billy Phelan's Greatest Game, great novels published. And now you can see the novelist influencing the journalist in Albany, which is a pretty fascinating kind of thing to sort of trace, which we don't think of. Here's that's something that's fascinating about that book also. There's a article, incidentally, doing that ancestor thinking by Susan Dumbleton that she is called Telling the Truth the Best Way I Can. And she writes somewhat about this and very well, and I'd recommend, and I can give you the citation of the article afterwards if somebody's interested in finding it. Well, to end, I think after that experience of writing serious journalism about the wrecking of Albany, the wrecking ball, if you like, by 65, William Kennedy turned on the most volatile issue in the country in 65, along with, I guess Vietnam would have been the most, but the second, or equally one, is race in America. And his reporting on the racial slums of Albany, on slum reporting, it was just fabulous. It was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. It won award for the NAACP, the Newspapers Guild, the New York State Publisher Awards. And what's interesting, this is the war on poverty of Lyndon Johnson going on. This is Bobby Kennedy grabbing that notion. And he writes with such detailed interest in about poverty, that it's really, it brings to mind, in a sense, George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, or the kind of approach that I think James Agee took in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men when he was trying to understand the sharecroppers of the South. And you can see that approach. What it is, it's not just serious journalism, but this great intent of purpose, that he was going to really tell this in a way that wasn't just newspaper reporting, that transcended it. And that he did. And what is so fascinating is from these experiences in journalism, you really get, in many ways, as I said early on, the springboard to William Kennedy's journalism. It would be hard to imagine Ironweed or the Phelan family or Legs Diamond, which was a great act of kind of being historian/investigative reporter to do that groundwork on Legs. Last night at dinner, William Kennedy told me he read the entire Daily News, had given him a lot of clippings and profiles, boxes of them, trying to understand who was the real, Legs. And so I think those careers in journalism, his journalistic endeavors had a profound influence, in fact, more than most writers, on giving him the notion of what was possible with fiction. Now, at the same time, some people like Kafka, Don Faulkner told me that something like, which I did not think of before, that Hawthorne was sort of a magical realist in some ways with the twice told tales and things early on. But I think the influence of having an understanding of Latin American culture right at the time when the Latin American novelists were becoming big, William Kennedy was on top of them before about anybody else in the United States. Marquez, Borges, Juan Rulfo, Vargas Llosa, on and on, Jorge Amado. I mean, he understood them, read them, and at that time there was that kind of dream-like quality in a lot of their works. And here he has this sort of gritty realism of somebody like an Agee as an influence, let's say, and of course the Faulkner and and Joyce and the notion of making your town like Albany a place of setting, and then these Latin American writers coming out. I don't think he learned as much from them. I think it was just coincidental. But I can tell you, William Kennedy's an extraordinary popular novelist in Latin America today, and all the writers down there have a great deal of admiration for him. They consider him one of the, if not the finest American novelists alive today. And so you could see how his career in journalism kind of moves around and has this sort of bedrock hold on him. So in closing, I would simply say that that if somebody, one of the lessons of William Kennedy is that if you want to be a journalist, read great fiction. Because no journalist that's going to be a good journalist won't have read all of Faulkner or all of Hemingway or have read Joyce. That, we sometimes reverse the thinking, and I would say that there's so many people that want to be a journalist. If you want to be good, it's not enough just to go out there and record what happened, but you need to really understand motives, intents, history, religion, philosophy, and it takes a lot of other second-tier reading to affect your journalism. And I think that's what made William Kennedy such an outstanding journalist, and why Albany is one of the really important books of journalism/history that's been written since World War II. Thank you.